Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Monday edition of Point of View, and hope you had a wonderful weekend. And we're going to get into all sorts of issues this week, and they're going to be wide-ranging, even in this next 2 hours, probably fairly wide-ranging, because I wanted to start off by talking about the fact that the Supreme Court is in session today. So we're going to talk about some of these cases, which many people think are some of the most significant in a generation. So we'll talk about what that means. We always like to kind of follow what has happened on the universities, and a very good piece that we've posted. It's our second article, Do Universities Still Care About Truth? And it is interesting that the person who's under attack now, Steven Pinker, first of all, is a Harvard professor. Second of all, if you wanted to find your consummate humanist, he's it. A matter of fact, I've done commentaries about the fact that he is crediting most of the great successes in the 20th and 21st century due to the Enlightenment and humanism. I counter that by saying I think some of that goes back to the Protestant Reformation, but whatever. But he's hardly the person you would consider to be canceled. You would be wrong, because you just stray 1 degree away from leftist ideology. And in this case, he's not really straying away. He's just simply giving you the facts, because he has many times been criticized by saying, for everybody saying the world has fallen apart, actually it's better than it's ever been before. There's less violence and all sorts of things. He also says there's less discrimination. Oh, that gets you in trouble with the critical race theory people. So we'll talk about that. And we'll spend a lot of time on it, but the whole issue of nepotism has surfaced in the Biden administration. As a matter of fact, even one of the ethics individuals who would be very supportive of Joe Biden is just simply saying this has sort of gotten out of hand. And the typical response to this is, well, what about Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump? And I go, and? I mean, we criticized some of that too, didn't we? I mean, obviously, we said that sometimes the son or daughter of an individual, or the brother, let's go all the way back to John F. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy. Robert Kennedy was the Attorney General. Sometimes that works out. And, let's be fair, Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump, especially Jared, we do have what's called the Abraham Accords, but still, nepotism, not a good idea. And this one is so blatant that even people that would be supportive of Joe Biden are bringing that up. So we'll get to that. And I thought, if we have time, I do want to talk about the new comptroller of the economy, because Professor Saleh Omarova actually graduated from Moscow State University on a Lenin scholarship. Now, I was going to talk about it anyway, and then our good friend Robert Knight pointed out that, just because you graduated from a Russian institution, it might actually open your eyes. I mean, he reminds us that Ayn Rand came out of the Soviet Union to expose some of this, but he says no such luck. He's right about that. You will not believe some of the things she's been saying, and I think the chances of her being confirmed, since she wants to basically eliminate all banks and let the Federal Reserve run everything. Oh, what could possibly go wrong with that? Almost guarantees that is she a sacrificial lamb? Why are there really honestly people in the Biden administration that would think that somebody who has a degree from a Marxist university actually espouses a lot of Marxist ideology, wants to eliminate the banks and put more authority in the Federal Reserve. Do they really think that that's a person's going to be confirmed in the United States Senate? We will get to that in due course. I was actually going to ignore that today because we have quite a lineup, because I might just mention we've got Daniel Darling with us in about a half an hour. Some of you have been saying, we really do need in the church to address the issue of race. How do we do that? Well, this new book, Ministers of Reconciliation, he's the editor of that. And I think for those of us that would teach a Sunday school class or would give a sermon, it's very helpful. But for all of us, how do some of these key verses in the Old and New Testament relate to the issue of race and racial reconciliation? Well, that's a really good piece. So we wanted to spend just a little bit of time with him before this hour is up. Next hour, we'll have Stuart McAllister, a good friend, and his son, Cameron McAllister, will talk about faith that lasts. So there will be some things that talk about politics. There's some things that will help you in your faith. There'll be some things that might even help you understand the issue of race. And that's just on Monday. Wait till we get through the rest of this week. We have lots of great guests and lots of great topics. But just before we take a break, let's acknowledge the obvious. The Supreme Court is meeting today without one of the members. Brett Kavanaugh is at least tested positive for COVID, although he's been vaccinated, so I don't think there's a big issue here. But nevertheless, this docket contains issues that are going to interest millions of Americans. Front and center, of course, one we've talked about. That is Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization, which will look at the constitutionality of this law out of Mississippi, which would ban nearly all abortions after 15 weeks. Now, we recognize that the original Supreme Court decision of Roe versus Wade allowed for any kind of jurisdiction, even kind of state involvement after what was called viability, but that's usually at 24 weeks. So the way this is written, it could be a challenge to Roe versus Wade or the later case of Planned Parenthood versus Casey. And so this is why so many people will look at it to see whether or not it could be used to modify or even overturn Roe versus Wade. So that will be where a lot of focus and attention will be. If we don't have enough attention, we also have a very important gun rights case coming out of New York State Rifle and Pistol Association, in which you have a case in which, of course, the Supreme Court has not ruled for many years on the issue of self-defense, but this has to do with a law limiting the carrying of guns outside the home. You had to show proper cause for this, and so this might once again bring some clarity on the issue of Second Amendment. So if abortion and Second Amendment weren't enough, let me now bring in the other two cases, both of which involve religious liberty, something we talk about on a pretty regular basis. You have Ramirez versus Collier, which is one that's not a big case, but it actually relates to, again, whether or not you can have clergy prayer and a number of other things for death row inmates. But the more significant one, which is also involved even our good friends at First Liberty and Alliance Defending Freedom and others, Carson versus Macon, which is a program out of Maine. And again, I want to say hello to our listeners up there in the state of Maine, which provided public financial assistance to children that would be attending a private school. But the limit was, as long as that private school did not provide religious teaching. And so this will get into the whole issue of, can you, in some respects, say, well, we will provide a benefit, but if it involves religion, we won't. What about equal protection, separation of church and state? Lots of issues there. And if those are not enough, and I think they're more than enough, there's one other case I'm going to be watching as well, and that has to do with the issue of affirmative action. Now, it's a little different, but it has to do with lawsuits brought by students who are of Asian descent, who have argued that they have unfairly faced discrimination because in an effort to, quote, have a better racial balance, those very high-achieving Asian American students were not allowed into Harvard. And so this could also provide a chance for the course to reassess its affirmative action jurisprudence. So if you wonder if we're going to be talking about the Supreme Court this year, I think you already recognize we have lots of cases, some of which are very significant cases. Most of these we'll talk about when they're oral arguments. And I suspect some of the most controversial ones won't be finally revealed till June. Let's take a break, though. We have a lot more to cover, and we will do that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, if you think about it, your life is the culmination of lots and lots of decisions. Jim Clifton, CEO of Gallup, argues that people make 10,000 to 20,000 small decisions every day. If you multiply this by the U.S. population, you end up with 1 quadrillion decisions. This is one of the points Jeff Myers makes in his book, Understanding the Culture. The legacy you leave is the sum of all your decisions. Many are inconsequential. Others determine the future direction of your life. Some don't seem that important at the time, but they turn out to be some of the most significant decisions you ever made. So how should we make decisions? First, we should consult the Bible. We know that God's will can be found in the Bible since it is full of specific commands and principles. Second, we should pray. We can discern God's will through prayer. Philippians 4:6 says, "Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God." Third, consult your conscience. If your conscience troubles you, then there is reason that you should stop and not proceed. Acts 24:16 says, Christians should strive to have a good conscience before God and man. By the way, a clear conscience isn't always a justification for proceeding. The Bible teaches the heart is deceitful above all things. We can easily deceive ourselves into sin. Finally, seek counsel. Proverbs 15:22 says, plans fail for lack of counsel, but with many advisors they succeed. Wisdom comes from many counselors. Share your decision with other godly men and women. Their collective response will often provide God's direction in a matter. As Christians, we should strive to make wise and godly decisions about our life. How we make decisions will affect the rest of our life and leave a legacy of faith for others to follow. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Critical Race Theory, go to viewpoints.info/CRT.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, one of the other articles I've posted here, do universities still care about truth? After all, if you go to a lot of the Ivy League schools, and I visited almost all of them, you will see something like, well, Yale's, for example, Lux et Veritas, Light and Truth, and almost all of them, have some kind of statement, you should know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. Of course, they don't usually mention the verse, although some of those still keep that up there in the concrete or the granite or whatever it might be, because indeed that was when those ideas really were considered to be somewhat mainstream. But this article that we've posted here by Karine Hajar actually reminds us that if you look at the complex nature of the universities, one thing you can come very quickly to, you don't have to look at any complexity other than to ask, when you do a survey, how many of them claim to be conservative? 8% of the Yale faculty, 3% of Harvard's faculty, which will be important in just a minute. And of course, what we find is that the cancel culture and, as she says, college have become disturbingly synonymous. One group that we've mentioned before, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. And I believe that we've had some individuals that have been working with that organization on the program. I think David French was with it. So again, this is an organization we've oftentimes illustrated. Nevertheless, they've looked at the various public attempts to sanction faculty members. Back just a few years ago, they had 76 examples Now they have 115, and the number's going up every single year. And so the one that I thought we would highlight for just a moment has to do with Steven Pinker. Now, if you're not familiar with him, he's a professor at Harvard University. He is probably best known for a number of books. Earlier book was The Better Angels of Our Nature, in which he was talking about the decline in violence, and then decided to write a book which I have on my shelf, Enlightenment Now. And that's where he makes the argument that if there's one thing that both the left and the right can agree on, it's that the world is getting worse. Except he says, no, it's not. It's getting better. There's less violence. There's more education. The reduction in poverty, which we've talked about on this program, the reduction in terrorist attacks, whatever it might be, as oftentimes scary as some of the things that we do talk about in this program are, the world really is getting better and better. And because he's a humanist, he would want to say that. That was certainly the idea at the turn of the last century, that the world's getting better. And then you had World War I, you had World War II. Okay, that kind of kiboshed all of that as well. Well, he now finds himself being not necessarily canceled. He's a tenured professor. He has enough prestige that nobody's going to unseat him any more than, remember J.K. Rowling when they came after her and said, you know, she's transphobic and that'll end her career? No, it won't, because she's got too much visibility. But that being said, you have this petition right now by the Linguistic Society of America wanting to remove him as one of their academic fellows. And you might say, why? I mean, he toes the humanist secular line completely. By the way, if you've ever read any of my commentaries, and I've had two that came out in 2018 about his two books, I point out that I, first of all, agree with much of his facts. I just disagree occasionally with some of his interpretation. I think some of the things that he points to are very significant successes in Western culture are due just as much to the Protestant Reformation, due as much to Christian worldview as they are to the Enlightenment. But we'll give credit where credit is due, because some of these advances have come from very secular people, but some of them have come from people that were theist or Christian. It's okay, I'll be fair with that. But nevertheless, how in the world did he find himself in the crosshairs of the cancel culture? Well, it turns out that he says, and I'll just quote him saying, you know, this petition is silly because citing an African-American social scientist who finds that overt racism is decreasing is apparently unsaleable and legitimate grounds for punishment. Now, the reality is he is pointing out all the incredible positive things that are happening in society, and one of which I think is sort of obvious to most of us, that overt racism is decreasing. Is Steven Pinker saying racism doesn't exist? No. Is he saying there might be subtle, even systemic racism? No. But just by saying that overt racism, it's just not politically correct, and it's certainly not even considered good manners to say something racist in public, okay? I think we'd all agree with that, but that's enough to get you pulled from one of these prestigious groups. And I feel sorry for him, because as much as I may disagree with some of his foundation principles, he is an individual that I enjoy reading. He's an individual that challenges me, because he argues there is no such thing as a mind. All we have is a brain. What you think is a mind is just created by this meat computer in your brain. And so he doesn't believe there's a soul, doesn't believe there's an afterlife, doesn't believe there's a mind, doesn't believe any of that. But again, you go through the facts and say, you know, if you just open your mind up a little bit to the possibility that God may exist and that human beings are created in the image of God, I think our facts and your facts fit better with all of that interpretation. But nevertheless, here is an individual who you would never have expected to be part of the attempt to cancel him, and I'm sure he'll survive. But it illustrates again, you stray just even 1 degree off of the leftist plantation right now, and the world comes crashing down on your head. Well, let's get on to another one. Nepotism, that's our third article. I think I posted that one today. I just wanted you to know about it because it's something that is surfaced in Democratic quarters as well. And one of the examples that you can find in this article is the fact that we now have the daughter of House Majority Whip Representative Jim Clyburn. Those of you in South Carolina are very familiar with him. He's a Democrat, and she's been appointed to a particular commission. Again, not necessarily saying she's not qualified for it, but it was the example being used there just in terms of optics. But then if you go down there, you begin to, and let me just read this one quote, White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, Senior Advisor Anita Dunn, White House Counselor Steve Ricchetti, White House Deputy Chief of Staff Bruce Reed, and Presidential Personnel Office Director Kathy Russell, each have at least one direct family member working in the Biden administration. I mean, it is a nepotism that would even maybe make Donald Trump blush. Okay, that might be hyperbole. We're not sure. But nevertheless, it is unbelievable how much that is. Unless you think, well, this is just because you don't like Biden. There is the ethics chief, which is part of the administration. That's Walter Schaub, who actually penned an op-ed that appeared in the Washington Post. And I love his line because this guy is supporting Joe Biden. He doesn't like Donald Trump, as you'll pick out, but he still says, we just can't defend this stuff. He says the Trump administration wasn't the first to have these problems, but Biden's pledge not to hire his family and his emphasis on diversity sparked hope that it would be the last. But whatever Biden meant when he promised a better way, it seems his administration now interprets that promise as narrowly applicable to his family. So this is something that I've sort of ignored until now, but it's gotten to, if you will, critical mass. And so if you hear somebody talking about this idea of nepotism in the administration, even the Democrats now are starting to say, Joe Biden, this has gone a little too far. And just before we run out of time and do our interview with Daniel Darling, I thought I would come back to the appointment by the Biden administration of Sally Omarova as the comptroller of the currency. She graduated from Moscow State University on a Lenin Personal Academic Scholarship. She still pretty much believes most of what she learned there. And, of course, she goes through some of the benefits of this. And I love our friends at the Wall Street Journal said, okay, maybe there was maternity benefits, but what about the gulag and no private property? But she's, for example, thinks that asset prices, pay scales, capital, and credit should be dictated by the federal government. In one recent paper, she said in the People's Ledger, she proposed that the Federal Reserve take over consumer bank deposits, effectively ending banking. I wonder what some of these bank presidents are going to say about that. And our good friend Robert Knight, if you want to read his piece, I didn't post it, but it just came out a few hours ago in the Washington Times, simply says this is something because we're talking about, as he said, a dyed red in the wool status, academic papers pushing the expansion of the Federal Reserve power to include setting prices, financial assets, and even calls for the Fed to take over consumer bank deposits and end banking as we know it. I will predict that there isn't a snowflake's chance that she will get confirmed, but I do sometimes want to come up to some of the people in the Biden administration and want to say, what were you thinking? Did anybody seriously think that somebody this leftist, this radical, this Marxist actually would be confirmed by the U.S. Senate? Let's hope not. If not, that's the end of the Republic as we know it. We'll be right back.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, Make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, at Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View.
The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
You know, over the last year and a half, we have certainly had a real desire to think about how to speak to the issue of race, racial reconciliation, even issues like critical race theory and all the rest. And so there has been a real desire to have information in that regard. And so I've always wanted to bring to the program various individuals that might be able to provide some help, especially for a moment. Let me talk to those of you that are pastors or Sunday school teachers or small group leaders, in which you might say, you know, I'd like to take some passages of Scripture and begin to deal with these in a more effective way. But I think for all of us want to know how to begin to come to a biblical conclusion about race and racial reconciliation. And so that's why we wanted to spend some time today talking about this book that came out a couple months ago, Ministers of Reconciliation, Preaching on Race and the Gospel. The editor is Daniel Darling. He's been on the program with us before, author, pastor, leader, individual that we've interviewed as he's been with different organizations over these years, a columnist for the World Magazine, regular contributor to USA Today, a graduate, at least studied at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, and a graduate of Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, is serving right now as the pastor of teaching and discipleship at Green Hill Church in Tennessee. And so, Daniel, welcome back to Point of View.
Hey, I'm delighted to be back on here with you.
Let's, if we can, for just a few minutes, maybe work our way through this. We'll start in Genesis, because I think this first article by Matthew Kim, Preaching on Race in View of the Image of God, you come down very quickly to a couple of key principles. Number one, everyone is in the image of God. All are created in the image of God, so there's no superiority or inferiority. And we also understand that when we talk about race, ultimately, the real race goes back to the human race, Adam and Eve. But what can we, as we find ourselves even reading the first book in the Bible, what can we learn, and what kind of principles can we actually begin to apply in terms of this issue of racial reconciliation?
Well, I think Genesis is foundational to trying to think our way through this, through race, because it tells us a couple of things. Number one, as you mentioned, it tells us that humans are created in the image of God, so every human being has worth and value, and not based on what they can produce, not based on their socioeconomic status, not based on their gifts or the way that they, their skin color or any of that, but they have value because God has stamped on each human being His image. And even after the fall, we see that with Noah, and even on into the New Testament, we see that language used about the image of God. So that is something that, regardless of our, what we bring to the table in terms of our productivity or what we've done, we bear the image of God. The second thing Genesis tells us, though, is that there's a reason why racism exists. There's a reason why human beings can develop prejudice in their heart toward one another. It's because of the fall, because sin has infected the human experience. Because of Adam and Eve, every human being has been born into sin, and has sin marbled up all through them in terms of the way they think, the way they act, the way they see other people. Our tendency as fallen people is to prefer ourselves and to diminish others. And so racism is really just one of many maladies that comes out of being a fallen human being. But we also see that race can, that sin has not just infected humans personally, but also has kind of marbled all through the human experience and has marbled all through this broken world. And so even, we could see sin not only at an individual level, but sin can happen at a systemic level. I mean, you look at kind of God's reasons for judging the earth with the flood is because sin had so captured the human experience and sort of the organizations and the systems of human life that God had to judge the world. And so we kind of, Genesis is really, I think, foundational for understanding race.
I think so. Well, I'm going to keep moving because you have a chapter on Psalm 139, and you do the same thing I do, and that is, whenever we, of course, in January have a Sanctity of Life Sunday, we almost always go to Psalm 139, which is a passage we almost use on the issue of abortion. So that's why I was thrilled that you have a whole section here on how Psalm 139 can help us with this issue of racial reconciliation.
Yeah, it really can. And one of the reasons I wrote that chapter was just to show how that passage is really powerful. And I think one of the things that is helpful when churches do is when we could talk about just the scourge of abortion, and how evil it is, and how, in many ways it is a systemic injustice against the most vulnerable people in our society, but also to use that to talk about race and the way we see each other. And I think talking about both of those at the same time is a good idea, because culturally, our political parties and pundits want to act like we can't care about racial reconciliation and we can't speak out against the evil of abortion at the same time, like you have to choose a side. And you really don't have to. Psalm 139 speaks to both of these issues. Psalm 139 tells us that every human being was carefully crafted by the Creator in the womb of the mother before they were born, and that all their days God knew them. This is a powerful scriptural apologetic against racism, that there are no human beings who are less than, who can be seen of as having less of the image of God. And it also keeps us from kind of the stereotyping that is fashionable in our culture, where we just only like to look at blocks and groups of people in a monolithic sense.
Yes.
All white evangelicals do this, and
right.
all black people do this. And Psalm 139 doesn't let us do that.
I think, if nothing else, what you've done here is taken a passage which many of us tend to use when we're teaching or preaching and focus on abortion, but help us understand that it certainly could relate to the issue of race. And jumping ahead, let me go to Matthew 28. This is a piece by J.D. Greer. It's been on the program with us, Race and the Great Commission. And I'll confess again, I use this passage primarily to talk about evangelism, but it also is a reminder of this idea of a multi-ethnic unity that needs to exist. I tend to use more of the book of Ephesians, but right there in the Great Commission, we have another opportunity to talk about racial reconciliation, don't we?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And this is an example of two things I like to say. That one, people will say, well, Pastor, how can we be preaching on race? Well, race is in the scripture. So as it comes up, I'm someone that preaches expositorily. So I preach through books of the Bible, so you can't help but bring it up if you're preaching through a passage that mentions it. But also, I think it should caution pastors to say, you're going to be tempted to be formed and shaped by pundits, by political parties, by everyone writing books and things on race. And some of those can be helpful. But for our own congregation, let's go back to what does the scripture say? And really help us think through this. And that's one thing I love about what J.E. does with the Great Commission passage, because Jesus does say, for us to go to all the nations, all the ethnos. In other words, there's no ethnic group for whom God has not sent Jesus to die for, and for whom that the mission of the church should not go for. And it tells us two things. It tells us, one, that there's no preferred ethnic race, right? Because every ethnic group needs to hear the good news of the gospel. Every group is lost in need of a Savior. But also it tells us the global nature of the body of Christ. And we see this really come into fruition in Revelation 5 and 7, where every nation, tribe, and tongue is gathered around the throne of God. This is the work that God is doing in the world.
Let's take a break, and let me just mention that we'll get to, of course, the book of Revelation in just a minute, but we need to take a break. Let me just mention, though, the book has been out for many months. You may be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we, of course, have a link so that you can get it in hardback or in Kindle, 13 chapters, and we've looked at just a couple of those. We obviously won't look at all 13. I thought when we come back, we'll look at Ray Ortland's piece on the ministry of reconciliation and maybe a couple others, but this would be very helpful if you're trying to make sense of some of the various claims and counterclaims right now. This would certainly help you kind of get back into the scriptures. And as an individual like Daniel who preaches expositorily, You find yourself every once in a while in these passages as you preach through and teach through these, but sometimes the natural inclination is to go one direction. This book will certainly encourage you to go in also a different direction and talk about the relevance of some of those passages to our contemporary discussion today about race and discrimination and reconciliation. So we'll come back and talk about this idea of a ministry of reconciliation, which of course is the title of the book, and then we'll get into a couple of other very short chapters. But if you find yourself saying you'd like to know more about this book, we have information about it at our website, which is pointofview.net. And Daniel Darling will continue with us right after these important messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us for a few more minutes Daniel Darling. He is the editor of this book, Ministers of Reconciliation, Preaching on Race and the Gospel. Next hour, we're going to have Stuart McAllister with us and his son Cameron McAllister as we talk about the book, Faith at Last. We'll get back into some of the issues in the news, but these are issues in the news, and I thought we would go to chapter 9. Ray Ortlund talks about the ministry of reconciliation. Of course, that's 2 Corinthians 5, and I think it, if nothing else, is a topic we need to address because the theme of the book is reconciliation. And again, there's a tendency, I think, Daniel, for those of us, and certainly I've preached through 2 Corinthians at least twice in my lifetime, to when we talk about ministers of reconciliation, talk about it in the vertical sense, which is very true, but also the reconciliation that needs to take place in the horizontal sense.
Yeah, I think it refers to both. I think Paul's referring to both there, that because we've been reconciled to God, we now have the ministry to help others both reconcile to God and reconcile to their fellow human beings. I mean, this, the outworking of the gospel is that the gospel is undoing what sin has destroyed, right? Sin pits human beings over and against each other. Sin has God's image bearers lashing out in violence and anger and division with each other, while the gospel brings people together. And so I think this is really important ministry. And I want to say, too, that it is a very countercultural message to be an ambassador of reconciliation. It's countercultural in really two ways.
Yes.
One, in that the world doesn't really want to hear that they are estranged from the God who made them, and that only through faith in Jesus Christ, who is the bridge between God and man, who took on their sins and paid for their sins and is their substitute. Only that way can they be reconciled to God. That's a message the world does not want to hear, but needs to hear. Number one. Number two, there's also people increasingly don't want to hear about reconciling to each other. There are so many perverse incentives today, both whether it's the social media algorithms or some of the way that people are rewarded today in society of being someone who is a divider, being someone who becomes popular with one particular tribe by pushing off and opposing the other tribe. And so to be someone who's reconciling, who is a bridge builder, even among Christians, is somewhat countercultural to say, I'm going to work hard as much as we can, where we can, to find common ground with brothers and sisters in Christ. And there's a lot of opposition to this from both the left and some places on the right. And I think as a Christian, this is a really important ministry.
Well, that brings me to two chapters I'll kind of cover simultaneously, chapter 5 and 10, because chapter 5 has to do with the Samaritan woman. And if you want to talk about not wanting to have common cause, the Jews did not want to be with the Samaritans. They wouldn't even be there, yet Jesus takes the time to go. And, of course, we know the story of the woman at the well. So you have that, if you will, bias that the Bible speaks clearly to. And then even as well in the New Testament, you have the one in chapter 10, which actually Jared Wilson refers to as Peter's sin of racism, because of the issue there about how Paul had to oppose him. So in these cases, we're actually given an opportunity to see how the Bible addresses bias, bigotry, and racism, don't we?
Yeah, we are. We really are. The case with the Samaritan woman was a case of both racial division, but also class division. The Samaritans obviously were worship. They did not accept the full, Hebrew scriptures. They only accepted part of it. They were sort of outcasts because they were mixed race, many of them. And then you have the woman herself, who was someone who had made a lot of bad choices, whose sin and the fall had marbled so deeply into her life that she had multiple husbands, and so this was not someone that people wanted to associate with, and Jesus kind of broke those barriers down to offer her living water. So he didn't affirm where she was, but he brought her the good news, the living water, to bring her to where he ultimately wanted to be, to give her a better way to live than the way she was living for herself. And same thing we see in Acts 10, that this is, Acts 10, you see that the church is experiencing growing pains. You have Jew and Gentile now trying to come together as one church, and you have two different cultures, two different ways of being and living. And Paul's saying, hey, wait a minute, because of the gospel, God brings both Jew and Gentile together, and really addressing Peter on that front. And it should also give us some hope that sometimes it's easy for us to look around and say, man, the evangelical church is so wrong, or we're so divided, and why is that? And you look at the very beginning of the early church, right there in the book of Acts.
There you are.
A church that was growing by leaps and bounds, people coming to faith, and yet they still have the same issues that we're dealing with. They're still trying to make this work. They still are tempted by the same things that tempt us today. And so I think that should also give us hope that as divided as we are today, that we have everything we need in the scriptures to come together as the people of God.
And I might just mention last chapter, of course, racial reconciliation, the victory of Christ on the book of Revelation. But just before we run out of time, Daniel, I wanted to get your thoughts. You're a pastor and have been for some time in various situations with different organizations, ministries, and the like. And as a result, I'd love to have you maybe speak to some of our listeners who might say, I know I need to address these issues, but I don't really know how to do so. In a sense, the book that you've been able to edit and put together provides a great resource for other pastors and Bible teachers and others to actually address these issues as they are preaching through the Scriptures.
Well, I hope so. And really, I think one of the things we need to do is really get together with people who might look differently than us or think a little differently than us, and for us to listen and learn and work on loving each other. And one of the things on this topic, particularly on race, it's so hot, it's so heated, there's so much division. And yet if we can say, man, I care deeply about this issue. I want to see brothers and sisters in Christ reconciled to each other to show the world what the kingdom of God looks like. And to do that, it means I'm going to have to listen. I'm going to have to love people who might think differently than me, and also just have a little bit of open-handedness to say, on the specific prescriptions for racism and racial reconciliation, you and I might disagree. We might land in a different place on specifically what should be done in society or what should be done in the church. But we're not going to let that divide us either. We're going to say, we both agree this is an issue. We want to work toward what the solutions are, but we want to most of all maintain our love for each other. And if we do that kind of work, that kind of bridge building work, I think it can have really powerful dividends. Christ is building his church, and that's the hope we have. And God is gathering people from every nation, tribe, and tongue. And we see this in the end of the book in Revelation, that this is a work God is doing, and this is our future. And so even as we participate in however small part that we have, we are participating in something that God is doing.
Well, again, Daniel Darling's been with us. We also have a link to his website, danieldarling.com. If you find yourself saying, I'd like to find the book, you might be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we have made it very easy for you to get it. Of course, you can go to his website and get his podcast, his articles, his books there as well, but we also have a link so that you can get it in hardback and in Kindle, and I would highly recommend it for those of us that find ourselves teaching, because it gives you an opportunity to think of other ways to use the existing scriptures to apply to some of the issues we find in our day. And most importantly, it is a way for all of us to learn a little bit more about how these key passages in Scripture apply to this very contemporary issue. So, Daniel, as always, thank you for your work in this particular area, and thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Well, thank you, sir, and I appreciate all the great work that you're doing, and I love being on with you.
Well, I'm sure we will do it again. And again, let me commend the book to you when we come back from the break. Fascinating story of kind of a father and a son, Stuart McAllister, but also getting to know his son, Cameron McAllister. Faith at Last, an InterVarsity Press book. We'll be right back.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
If you listen to Point of View, we spend a fair amount of time telling you, first of all, and trying to instruct you on how to articulate a biblical worldview. But we also talk about the need to be able to defend a biblical worldview, which is known as apologetics. Now, as we do that, we also talk about what's going on college campuses. And even when I joined Probe Ministries 45 years ago, we had a brochure that said, when your kids go off to college, where they lose their faith. But I very quickly learned, even not going to college, but just growing up, there's a time in which sometimes young people have to say, I don't want to just keep having the faith of my parents. I want to have it to be my own. But that's when they raise really good questions. And so there's a real concern sometimes about how much information, how much influence to give, and what happens if indeed a young person decides to be kind of the prodigal of the family. And so this particular book we're going to be talking about this hour gets into all sorts of issues, from theology, apologetics, parenting, child-parent relationships. I think you're really going to enjoy it. It's a book published by InterVarsity Press. It has the title, Faith That Lasts, A Father and Son on Cultivating Lifelong Belief. One of the authors is an individual I've known many years because we sometimes speak at conferences together. Stuart McAllister, speaker and writer, became a Christian in Scotland in 1977, has traveled the globe, as you may well know, with the Ravi Zacharias ministry, 45 years almost of ministry as well, written chapters in the books Beyond Opinion and Global Missiology for the 21st Century. And Stuart, it is always great to chat with you.
Great to hear your voice, Kerby. It's been a while.
Well, and we will catch up in that regard. But first of all, let me also introduce someone else who I'm meeting for the first time, although I did watch a video that the two of you did the other day, and that's Cameron McAllister. He is an individual that, as you might imagine, is the son of Stuart McAllister and his wife, a co-host of Thinking Out Loud, a weekly podcast about current events, also staff writer with the Christ and Pop Culture, also has done film and television reviews in Christianity Today, was actually born in the mission field in Vienna, Austria. And Cameron, welcome to Point of View.
Thank you, Kerby. It's great to be here.
Might just mention we have both links to your websites, information about this book, and again, people might be able to find it in a local bookstore. But Stuart, can I come to you for just a minute and kind of set the scene here? Because in some respects, this is a book that breaks into three very significant sections. First of all, the common misconceptions in Christian homes, which then, Stuart, you tell your own story. Then the father's response to those misconceptions, and we can get Cameron's story, and then the son's response to those. So you've got some great responses from both of you. But the book you wrote in large part because there was a time in which you began to sense where Cameron was going. You asked a very tough question that I don't think he liked at the time, but it kind of started the conversation, didn't it?
Yes, yeah. Basically, I think the big thing for me, Kerby, was I grew up in a non-Christian home, and coming to Christ was a very real. It was a conversion experience. It was a big reality, and the whole Christian life was a revolution to me about everything. My biggest fear when I became a father, and then I realized I had children. I saw Christians, not all bad, but I saw many growing up in the bubble, and my fear was that either through my failings in my own personal life or through lack of ability, I would anesthetize my kids to the faith. So one of the problems and one of the struggles I had was with Cameron and Catherine was whether or not they would actually own the faith from their heart as opposed to being in a religious household. And when we moved to the States from Austria, that was sadly part of the pattern that began to emerge. And so it became a bit of a crisis, really, for me.
You know, Cameron, I watched the video in which at one point you said, you know, somebody asked you years ago, are you going to go into the same profession as your father? Go, you know, not a snowflake's chance, not happening at all. Of course, that's exactly where you ended up today. So there was a time in which you couldn't even imagine doing what you're doing today. Is that fair?
That's very fair. Yeah, I think this is a common, experience for a lot of young people who have grown up with parents who are in frontline ministry of some kind, whether they are pastors' kids or their parents just work in ministry as missionaries. I wanted to stand apart. I wanted to do something else. And also, we can talk about this maybe a little bit later, I was completely unprepared for the shock of cultural Christianity. That was something I didn't really come across until I moved to the United States from Austria, which is a largely secular country, to the Bible Belt South. So that was something that took me off guard.
Well, and I think that's something that our listeners, depending on where they're listening right now, can either relate to or not, because when you think of people that listen to this program, for example, from Northern California all the way through Oregon and Washington, or for our listeners in Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Vermont, Maine, that is in some respects a little bit more like what exists in Europe, because there aren't as many Christian churches there. But listeners that are maybe in the Midwest or especially the South, which have these huge mega churches, in some respects, Stuart, that's another issue that Cameron addressed, because you have a lot of people that are sort of culturally Christians, but they really don't seem to take their faith quite as seriously because there isn't necessarily a challenge to their faith.
Yeah, I mean, that was a big factor. I went to Vienna, and my first mission assignment, I was a part of a Bible smuggling team in Eastern Europe. So we traveled through the communist countries, and I was arrested several times for my faith. And I understood the cost and consequences, and that was the Christianity that I was brought into. And I had sought our kids to understand that as a principle. So when we came here, and at first we were trying to get them to be involved in the church that we were in, they would come with us to church. There was no unwillingness in terms of belief, but they were quickly bringing to our attention, kids who were sleeping around and taking drugs or whatever, which happens, we know, in many places. But the heart was trying to get the heart issue. It was to believe because you were committed, you were sold out, you loved God, you wanted the will of God and the ways of God, and how to convey that without the moralism or the religious controls or using fear as an instrument in their life. We're trying to avoid that and get an actual conversation so that we were discussing who God is and what Jesus is like and what the gospel really means, and try to make that the conversation as opposed to mere religious conformity.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll get into some of the different misconceptions. I might just mention that this book is actually full of great insight, about 200 pages, 9 chapters. Came out earlier this year, so you should be able to find it. But, of course, as we always have done, we have a link so that you can get it in paperback or Kindle. We have more information about the book. And as we're talking about today with a father and son, I'm just thinking ahead. Later this week, we'll have Anne Graham Lotz and her daughter, and so we'll be talking about a daughter as well as a mother in that particular situation, although I suspect we may get into some of the same issues. That book that we will be talking about with them is a little bit different. But when we come back, we'll look at this whole idea of some of these common misconceptions in Christian homes, so that if you are raising children or grandchildren, maybe you can learn some lessons vicariously from this. And then we'll move on to the whole issue of how both the father and the son respond to some of those misconceptions. And if you find yourself saying you'd like to get a copy of the book, well, it's endorsed by Scott Sauls, Holly Ordway, Mary Jo Sharp, Oz Guinness, all guests that have been on the program. And it's out, and you should be able to get a copy. We'll continue our conversation about faith that lasts right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, if you think about it, your life is the culmination of lots and lots of decisions.
Jim Clifton, CEO of Gallup, argues that people make 10,000 to 20,000 small decisions every day. If you multiply this by the U.S. population, you end up with 1 quadrillion decisions. This is one of the points Jeff Myers makes in his book, Understanding the Culture. The legacy you leave is the sum of all your decisions. Many are inconsequential. Others determine the future direction of your life. Some don't seem that important at the time, but they turn out to be some of the most significant decisions you ever made. So how should we make decisions? First, we should consult the Bible. We know that God's will can be found in the Bible since it is full of specific commands and principles. Second, we should pray. We can discern God's will through prayer. Philippians 4:6 says, "Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your request to God." Third, consult your conscience. If your conscience troubles you, then there is reason that you should stop and not proceed. Acts 24:16 says, Christians should strive to have a good conscience before God and man. By the way, a clear conscience isn't always a justification for proceeding. The Bible teaches the heart is deceitful above all things. We can easily deceive ourselves into sin. Finally, seek counsel. Proverbs 15:22 says, plans fail for lack of counsel, but with many advisers they succeed. Wisdom comes from many counselors. Share your decision with other godly men and women. Their collective response will often provide God's direction in a matter. As Christians, we should strive to make wise and godly decisions about our life. How we make decisions will affect the rest of our life and leave a legacy of faith for others to follow. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Critical Race Theory, go to viewpoints.info/CRT.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue the conversation today with Cameron McAllister and Stuart McAllister on the book Faith at Last, a Father and Son on Cultivating Lifelong Belief. Let me, before we get into some of the misconceptions, also acknowledge that you have an introduction. Stuart, I'll come to you first, and then Cameron. Your home has a culture, whether you like it or not. I think there's a tendency to think, well, the culture is out there. You know, the culture is a secular culture. The culture is a Christian culture. But there is a culture in a business, there's a culture in a ministry, and there's also a culture in a family, isn't there?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, when we think, anytime you visit someone's home, I mean, you do this obviously when you go overseas and you go into someone's house and you see the way that they handle things. But whether it's another home here in America, you see the way that people, their traditions, the way they serve food, the way they talk to each other. So it's, without doubt, it's a foundational thing of all lives. That culture, there's a culture in every family, how we process, how we deal with things, what we value, what we think is important. And because that's unconscious to many people, that either inhibits the advance of the gospel or it can be a bridge for it. And I would say when it's unconscious, it inhibits because we don't know what's in our own family gathering that stops us from being able to hear or present the gospel to each other.
So again, Cameron, what about that? Because you certainly saw two different kind of cultures, if you will. One that was somewhat influenced from the outside in certainly Austria, and then a different one in, say, Atlanta, Georgia.
Yes, I mean, the notion that your home is kind of a protective haven from culture makes a certain kind of sense, but of course our homes are porous. I mean, just look at what our phones will do, how much they open up. So the culture permeates our homes, it comes in, and what's interesting is that often if we think that our home doesn't have a culture, and this is what we argue in the introduction, the chances are that the surrounding culture has pretty much shaped your home. So just think about some of the deeply ingrained values of our own day, which just basically center on your own freedom, the ability for you to call the shots in your life. You're basically in charge, and the main goal is for you to pursue happiness and some kind of satisfaction. Well, that actually doesn't have a whole lot to do with what we find in Scripture, where we're told to take up our cross, where self-denial is a major part of our day-to-day lives, and where we are also given phrases like, you are not your own. In some ways, I can't think of a more counter-cultural statement. And so that's why it's very important to pay attention to the actual values that are shaping our homes. And yeah, the contrast was very striking for me, because Austria is a nominally Catholic nation, but it's largely secular. And so it's funny because on the one hand, you're surrounded by these beautiful historic churches. You've got St. Stephen's Cathedral, which is just an architectural marvel. But over there, it's not really a house of worship. It's more of a museum. It's a pretty haunting experience to go in there, because most people are they're looking at all these strange relics of the past, the stained glass and the altars, and they don't really understand it. Those are relics of a bygone era. But then when I moved to the Bible Belt South, I came into an environment where everybody claimed to be a Christian. Certainly everybody went to church, but in their day-to-day lives, often they lived exactly as they wanted to. They did whatever they wanted to. And there's a helpful phrase there that comes from Craig M. Gay, where he just calls that practical atheism, where essentially in your day-to-day life, when you leave the church service or you leave the conference or you leave the Bible study, you live as though God does not exist, as though his authority isn't real at all. And that's what I saw a whole lot of.
And so, again, we've seen that, especially as we talk about the younger generation, kind of a therapeutic, moralistic deism and those kinds of things. But let's get into some of the misconceptions. One of those is fear protects. By the way, we'll talk about fear protects, information saves, spiritual education belongs to experts. But as you talk about, Stuart, the issue of fear, one of the quotes comes from, matter of fact, a couple of them come from Jonathan Haidt and Coddling of the American Mind. Now, he's been on the program with us, not a Christian by his own admission, but this whole idea of fear, you see this right now as this idea that the battle is not between people that agree and disagree with me. In other words, if you may disagree with you, I think you're wrong. No, you are evil. And so we are kind of living in a world right now that they talk about that has been starting on the campus and now is made its way into the culture, that really life is a battle between good people and evil people. So you have to use fear to raise your kids. Talk about that misconception.
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, that's certainly the wider picture, but it's also, as we well know, it's a part of much of the Christian scene today, because people reacting to the rising sort of sense of secularism, the invasion of some of the sexual ethics, and all of the many things that are going on, fear becomes an instrument. And so we try to scare people into righteousness, or sometimes we that we use the wrong kind of fear. I think the Bible very clearly does talk about the fear of the Lord, but the very nature of that needs to be defined, the reverence for God, the holiness of God, that's shaping life. But the fear of our minds being controlled, our bodies being taken over, the government taking away all our liberties, and American culture, I think, almost fosters at times a sense of paranoia. And there's a type of Christian, we get stuff forwarded to us all the time. We all do. I know you do too, Kerby. People sending you stuff of the latest conspiracy darkness. And you could get up in the morning and spend your time just in terror, thinking, there's a demon behind every bush. There's stormtroopers coming through the door, or communists, or wherever it is. Someone's coming to get us. And we lose sight of the vision of God is in control. We are under his Spirit's leadership, and we need to make a difference. So fear should not be used as an intentional instrument of control in our homes or anywhere else, I think.
Cameron, what about this idea? Because you write about this idea of fear of failure. And I've said before, when we've sometimes talked about sexually transmitted diseases, we've had individuals here just talk about the fear and you're going to get these diseases. But we've had other people here talking about just say yes. In other words, say yes to your goals, yes to your dreams. In other words, let's not make it fear-based. Let's, instead of replacing this idea of fear or that you're going to fail, you're going to get an STD, or you're going to leave the faith, talk about the positive aspects, the way in which I can really cause you to dream better dreams and not to be incapacitated by the possibility that there might be some kind of failure in your life.
Yeah, I think I'm going to say something that will sound initially a little bit alarming, so just bear with me. But I think one of the really challenging aspects of being a parent is providing some safe parameters for your children to fail within reason.
Sure.
When my son Dylan was still an infant, when we would take him to his pediatrician, the pediatrician would look at Dylan's little legs and he would note with approval all of the bruises and lacerations, and he would say, aha, this is good. That means he's taking risks. That means he's learning. And there's an abiding principle there. We never really outgrow the need to kind of stumble forward, because to err, after all, is human. Now, again, you want to establish this within reason in your home. You have a home, and there are rules that your children will need to abide by. But they also need to be able to make mistakes and to learn from those mistakes. If we really want to develop our moral reasoning, we've got to be able to make mistakes. And so in the chapter where I respond to that fear protects mindset, I talk about this notion of failing successfully. And I actually, depending on your perspective, I may maybe throw my own parents under the bus a little bit, because I think they were very courageous, because they actually allowed me to fail quite a bit and to mess up quite a bit. Especially I was absolutely miserable student, and I talked to a lot of our family friends who would send in their little family newsletters of the glowing successes of their kids, and they would go up on the fridge. I didn't have anything that was going to go up on the fridge. I graduated by the skin of my teeth. But through this whole journey, I was truly learning more and more about what it means to lead a life that is holistic and that is in pursuit of the good. And my parents never stopped annoyingly, relentlessly asking me difficult questions that forced me to articulate what it was I was actually doing. And so I think you've got to have some room in there for your children to grow. And I mean, all three of those misconceptions, fear protects, information saves, and spiritual education belongs to experts. All three of those revolve around an illusion of control. And so that's a big part of what was going into the thinking there.
We'll take a break, and we have a lot more to cover. Many other misconceptions, all part of the book Faith at Last. We'll be right back.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation about the book Faith at Last. Cameron McAllister and Stuart McAllister, a father and son on cultivating lifelong belief. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Although I suspect many of you just kind of want to sit back, take some notes, and learn vicariously from these two individuals. And Stuart, I thought we'd come to another misconception. Information saves. That is a big mistake sometimes, especially in the Bible churches, but you ask a good question early on. How many of our kids kids know all about Christianity but don't know Christ. And oftentimes we encourage people to send their kids off to the Probe Mind Games camp or to Summit Ministries. But one of the things we do at Mind Games camp, and I know that some other people like Sean McDowell have done this. We introduce somebody supposedly as an atheist, go into the audience and start asking questions of the kids. And boy, they're really good with the one-liners. They're real good with what Christianity is, or the little phrase, the catchphrase. But you begin to ask even more penetrating question, and pretty soon all the kids are looking at their shoes. They don't even want to make eye contact, because you do see a situation in which we sometimes are very good at dispensing information, which is necessary, but it's not sufficient, is it?
No, I think I always liked the idea what C.S. Lewis talked about, the fact of the connection between the information and the imagination, that, you know, that the reason is the organ of truth and imagination is the organ of meaning. And I really thought a lot about this, Kerby, both in writing the book, but in trying to keep, as a communicator, working with people as I'm talking to them. People can give me parrot answers to basic Christian questions, and I see a lot of catechizing going on in the church, but sometimes people miss it because the information has never moved into the heart. There's never been an imaginative explosion. And one of the things I think that Lewis did very well was to try to help people to see it, to feel the truth. And I think in our conversation with my kids, I realized they had plenty of Bible information. We didn't need to give them more facts. They had been reading the scriptures. In fact, when Cameron went into the difficult phase, I mean, I was asking him, why do you think you're a believer? Not because he didn't believe the right things. He knew the facts, but it was clear there was a discrepancy between what was being believed and what was being lived out. And that was the ignition point I was seeking. So not more facts, not more data, although we need instruction and information, but the ignition where the imagination and the heart came together into a commitment.
You know, Cameron, one of the things, and this maybe is truer of those who are younger than you, but I'm hearing more and more, because we just finished doing this survey of 3,000 plus individuals, Generation Y, and especially Generation Z. Generation Z, the first digital natives, they don't need more information. They are overwhelmed with information. Information is not the issue. It's trying to make some sense out of it. And your dad was just talking about this idea of the imagination, information and imagination, because, as he pointed out, you knew a lot of the facts, but that wasn't necessarily connecting with you, was it?
No, I think what needs to happen is people need to see what Christianity is, and it needs to be lived out in your life. So there needs to be flesh on the bones. And part of the imagination's role in our knowing, it's roughly the difference between somebody who looks at a blueprint and sees only a bunch of esoteric kind of symbols and somebody who can see a finished bridge. The imagination is what helps us actually see the full picture. And I think you do have, you've just got a moment where we are flooded with information. We have access to reams and reams of it. But we're very weak on wisdom and discernment and knowing how to put it together and how to actually move forward in understanding and, in a word, to live well. And I've often pointed out one of the kind of boogeymen of sort of conservative Christian circles, a kind of Michael Myers figure, is the dreaded atheist professor who's supposedly going to dismantle your child's beliefs. But, of course, if a professor is asking you questions about your deep convictions, they're just doing their job. They should be doing that.
And you should be able to answer those too. Yeah.
You should be able to answer them. And part of that articulously involves more than just your words and being able to talk about worldview. That's all important. But the difference should be visible in your life. And I think one of the really powerful markers of Christian men and women in today's world is a sense of peace and stability. There's no cultural peace and stability, but if you're following Christ and you're confident that he is on his throne, he's in control, and your life is in his hands, there's a peace and a calm and a tranquility to your life that simply makes you stand out and is going to look deeply strange, and it will invite questions. I think a lot of the apologetic questions these days will be less evidential-based less technical and they'll revolve more around the question, why are you the way you are? What makes you tick? Why do you stand out like this?
Yes, there again, not just the cognitive, but more the motive and emotive type. And if there's a word that keeps surfacing again and again in some of these interviews with especially the younger generation, especially Generation Z, it's the word authenticity. Now, I recognize it's kind of a buzzword, so, I mean, don't everybody roll their eyes at once. You know, when you say we want to make it relevant, roll the eyes. We're looking for authenticity, roll the eyes. But move past that, because there is a sense in which people today are, especially the younger generation, have been sold most of their lives. Everybody's trying to sell them something, if you will. And so they're just simply saying, yeah, you're selling, but I'm not buying because I don't see any difference in your life. And it seems to me, Cameron, that's exactly what caused you to say, until I see it really honestly lived out, don't expect me to go and live it as well, because if it's not working for you, don't try to market it to me.
And part of the power of having faithful parents was that it took away the luxury of me just being able to say, well, Christianity is clearly just a sham. It's all a bunch of hypocrites who are saying one thing and then doing something else. Sure, that's true that's sadly part of the human condition. But my parents weren't perfect, but they are faithful Christians. And so what was becoming more and more clear to me as my dad asked me some of his, what I thought at the time were invasive questions. Why do you call yourself a Christian? Why are you living like this? What was becoming clear to me was that he was speaking with real spiritual authority, because I saw the man behind the curtain. I saw him behind the scenes, and I knew that he truly believed. He was living it out day to day, and that gave him a moral and spiritual authority that was very powerful. I mean, that's the authority of Christ. And that's really what we need to speak out of as Christian men and women. And it's perfectly possible to be a very gifted communicator, somebody who could speak at Q Ideas or give a TED Talk and have a heart that doesn't belong to Christ. But it's impossible to show forth a transformed character without his presence in your life. And I think what people are crying for when they use words like authenticity, or they want a holistic picture of Christianity, is they want to see Christ in you. Nothing more, nothing less. And I think that's the call, and that's the challenge to each of us who follows Jesus, is to show that forth to people who desperately need to see it.
And again, when you see these books that have come out, David Kinnaman, of course, we interview George Barna on a regular basis. I think we had him on this week. I mean, they can certainly point to, and even some of the surveys we've done more recently can point to those who say, well, the reason I'm not a Christian is because, first of all, I think it's anti-scientific, or maybe I think it's anti-gay or something like that. But the one that surfaces and has surfaced throughout centuries is hypocrite. And one of the things that was so striking about that is that you've heard that phrase. We've all heard that phrase. But then they went back and asked those individuals, do you know somebody who is a Christian who you believe is a hypocrite? And 3/4 of them said that they did. So obviously it gets into this issue of living an authentic life. So of course, we've quoted C.S. Lewis. How about Francis Schaeffer? You know, before the watching world, we just have too many people today that are calling themselves Christian who aren't, or if they are, not living a consistent life. And nobody lives a perfectly consistent life. But if, again, as I said, if you are wanting to make a decision about whether or not to change your orientation, if you're one of those so-called unaffiliated, or sometimes we call them the nuns, atheist, agnostic, or no preference, and you look at people that might have an answer and they don't look like they have an answer, you can see why you certainly walk away from them. So let's take a break, because I know when we come back, we want to at least get one other misconception, and that is spiritual education belongs to experts. If you find yourself saying, this would be a really helpful book for me, but also for others that I might know that are raising their children and want to understand what not to do, this book, Faith That Lasts, is published by InterVarsity Press. You may be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we have links so that you can get it in paperback or Kindle. And we are privileged to have with us today Cameron McAllister and Stuart McAllister. And we'll come back and pick out just one more of those misconceptions in this very well-written book. And we'll continue our conversation right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Faith at Last, endorsed by such people as Scott Sauls and Mary Jo Sharp and Oz Guinness and many others that have been on this program. And we are talking today with Cameron McAllister and Stuart McAllister. And Stuart, let's talk real briefly about this idea of spiritual education belongs to experts. I think most of our listeners know that's not true, but we sometimes unintentionally tend to imply that in our homes and even sometimes in our churches, don't we?
Yes, I think just quickly, Kerby, the idea often is when kids may have questions and should have questions and will have questions, and the tendency perhaps by some parents is just to say, oh, well, the youth pastoral handout or Youth for Christ or Campus Crusade. And so basically what we do is we don't develop our spiritual muscles and just our family interaction. And the danger is that we think someone else should take responsibility. We need to let truth be nurtured within the home and in all of our lives.
outsourcing the problem. And Cameron, talk about that one, because I have run into that problem not only with parents that say, I'm going to give it to the youth pastor, but I've run into youth pastors say, I don't know how to answer these questions, so I'll delegate it to someone else. And one of the things we do at our Main Games camp is we have a question box, and you can ask any question you want, and you can even make it anonymous. And sometimes the kids say, that's the first time I've been allowed to ask a question, and even ask some really tough questions, because sometimes if you ask those questions, everybody looks at you like, well, what's wrong with you for asking those questions? And I suspect there was a time in which you were asking some pretty significant questions, weren't you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are many homes where some questions, they're basically, for many different reasons, not question-safe zones.
Right.
I remember I've run into many kids over the years who have said, yeah, we're not allowed to ask anything about the problem of evil, for instance, in our home. I remember talking with one person, and then when I said, well, why? Well, my brother, who's older, who went to college, really wrestled with that issue, and then he ended up walking away from Christianity, and so now we're just not allowed to talk about it anymore.
Wow. Yeah.
So very understandable, and my heart goes out to parents, because I'm a parent myself, and it is very difficult. And on a routine basis, you're going to be put in emotionally, spiritually, and intellectually impossible situations. Your kids will do that to you. That's part of life. And so it's important to remember that we're relying on Jesus Christ to help us, and his Holy Spirit and the church to work with us. But part of what we have to do is we have to be willing to work through questions. We're not all experts, and we don't have exhaustive knowledge on every single question. And many of the questions that come to us from our kids, and every age has unique challenges, but many of them are exceedingly complex. You think about the questions right now surrounding identity and sexual expression. These are very tough issues. So there needs to be a commitment to be willing to put in the work, to maybe do some research, to work through these issues. But I think what we need to do is let go of the notion of total control. That's where those misconceptions come in again. Because remember, it's not information in the end that's going to save your kids. What needs to be reached in the end is their heart, not just their mind. And the real difference of a parent who's willing to wrestle through questions with their kids, walk through those issues with them, it's just unimaginable the difference that makes, versus a parent who basically out of some sense of either fear or insecurity shuts it down or tries to outsource the problem. As Dad was saying earlier, the primary person who is in charge of the child, your stewardship, the primary responsibility falls to you as a parent. And also, you know your kid better than other people do. You may not have all the answers. Nobody has all the answers. But that spiritual responsibility is there. And if you're willing to work through this with your kid, and also enlist the help of others, but it's just important not that you don't try to in any way push away that responsibility. This is after all your child, and the Lord gave you your child. It's not an accident. This is a gift to you. It's an awesome gift, but it is a gift nonetheless, and we need to be willing to walk through these issues and wrestle through the questions with our kids.
Stuart, I was just thinking that this broadens something we've talked about before with William Lane Craig, because he said, look, all of us have doubts. And when you have a doubt, take that doubt and really research it, because when you then find the answer to it, you're going to have a great deal of confidence next time when you address that. What this does is broaden it to say, when your child has a doubt or your child has a question, work its way through that. And since you and I are the two old guys around the table, I can remember a time when I was in graduate school, and the books I had in my hand, one was a Josh McDowell book and one was a Norm Geisler book. That's all I got. And I started reading Francis Schaeffer, but there is an abundance of very good, well-written material on the internet and books. So again, for a person to say, I don't really know where to go to find answers, really? If anything, the difficulty is finding how many other resources, in addition to the ones you may be locked in on, give you answers. So this is something that has become easier over the last couple of decades, hasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. As you said, Kerby, when we were younger, there were a few books, but you could name them, and anybody who was trying to get informed could read all of them within a year. I mean, now there are whole websites, organizations, whether it's scientific, philosophical, theological, biblical, at every level there's materials. Now that takes time, but it's the heart and the commitment. And I think even if I've heard people saying I've said to I'm not an intellectual. I'm not an intellectual. I was a bouncer in a dance hall. I left school when I was 15 years of age. I have sought answers to questions based on trying to find an answer that I could live with and that I could share. Any parent can do that. We don't need to be an intellectual. We don't need a PhD. We don't need to have a master's degree. If you've got those things, wonderful. But with your kids, showing that you take effort to do some research, that you dig into the territory, you help them, you watch things together. It's an act of love. Communication and commitment to truth is an act of love, and it's costly grace. But it can be done. It must be done. It's part of our duty as good Christians, as people who love God with all our mind, our heart, and our soul. And we need to take that part very seriously.
Let me just mention that if people want to connect with you, of course, we have both of your Twitter accounts. We have the link to the website. But Stuart, maybe you can speak for both of you. I would think that you are such a great speaker, and I'm sure Cameron is as well. Some people might want to say, I'd like to have you come to a men's retreat and talk about parenting, maybe have you speak in an apologetics or a missions conference. If people would want to contact you and find out a little bit more, maybe to have you come and speak, where would you be able to contact you, and what is available in terms of resources?
Well, we'll probably very shortly have a website up for Faith That Lasts, thinkingoutloud.org. But I'm also connected with Ken Boa, kenboa.org. That's Reflections Ministries here in Atlanta. And either of those connection points would probably work. We've been in the process of trying to get some of these things organized and set up. So, but if you can click on the web, a link, you'll probably find us in one of those two places. Thinking Out Loud Together is the name of our organization, and the website is just going up. But reflections.org with Ken Boa is another opportunity.
We think very highly of Ken Boa. I've known him for decades, known him longer than I've known you. And I've known you a long time. So first of all, say hi to your wife. I've always enjoyed having meals with you at Camp of the Woods. I'm sure there'll be another opportunity for us to cross paths, but I'm glad that we could cross paths on phone. Cameron, great to meet you for the first time. And both of you, don't be a stranger. We'd love to have you back, because we certainly think very highly of the work that you're doing, and certainly think very highly of this new book. It's been out a couple of months, Faith That Lasts. It is published by InterVarsity Press, a father and son on cultivating lifelong belief. So thank you both for being with us today here on Point of View.
Thanks, Kerby.
Thanks for having us.
We're going to take a break, and then when we come back tomorrow, we're back at it again. There's a film that we want to talk about. Of course, I also mentioned about Anne Graham Lotz, and her daughter will be with us on Wednesday. We got covered all through the issues. I'm going to be with Mike Huckabee. I'm certainly hoping we can get him in studio here before the end of the week, but we'll see. So that's why you want to listen every single day. First of all, I want to thank Doug for engineering the program. I want to thank Steve for producing it, and we encourage you to join us tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/sign-up. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/sign-up. pointofview.net/sign-up. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.